Hey guys, it's Kelsey here. Happy Friday. So of course Friday is the day of Freya, the Norse goddess, also known as Frigg. She ruled love, sex, war, and celebration. So whichever of those you are having at the moment, I hope it's a fantastic one and a fantastic weekend as well. So let's talk about the 12 houses in astrology. So I've already obviously sent you guys some keywords around each of the houses, and you've sort of seen them in your own chart, but I wanted to just run through each one of them and how they all kind of fit into each other. So the first thing I wanted to say is, if you are doing any Googling at any stage, any internet research, or even looking in books as far as astrology goes, bear in mind that up until probably only maybe 30 years ago, astrology was mainly practiced openly anyway, by men, by wealthy, educated, conservative men. And so with some traditional interpretations in astrology, you'll find they can be very fatalistic. So you'll get what I mean when I talk a little bit more about some of the houses. But if you're ever Googling or researching anything and it's like, this is a terrible placement, or, you know, people with this placement in their natal chart go on to be serial killers, or, you know, whatever thing, take everything that seems fearful or negative with a grain of salt, bearing in mind that what is portrayed as negative sometimes by traditional interpretations would have been seen as negative by conservative old white men. But given that the majority of us on this course, to my knowledge, are not conservative old men, they don't really apply to us. So, as I said, I'll explain this a little bit more. Let me go through the houses in the natal chart. Here's just a wee one that I have printed off. Obviously, in your own chart, you've got all your wee planets and everything in here. In the next video as well, I will go through all of the signs and talk about them a little bit more. So you can refer back to this at any time just to get some more idea on what each house rules. So the way that the houses work is that they represent each stage of our development, each stage of our human psyche. So of course we begin with house number 1, which in this chart here is by the ascendant. So we've already talked about the ascendant a few times, and so the ascendant always rules the first house. So the first house is the house of the self, the house of identity, the house of personality, of what things drive us, so, and how we come across to others. Because when you think of, you know, the very first stage in life, it's the baby emerging into the world. It's how the baby sees things. It's its existence, how it came to be, and how it's going to move forward. So that is what the first house rules. So any planets you have in this first house will impact you physically, will impact you the way that you speak, the way that you present yourself. And especially when looking for inspiration, you know, it's always interesting to have a look at what is around your ascendant, because this is influencing how you come across, or even how you perceive the rest of the world. So that is house number 1. And then, of course, what do babies do once they move past that initial, you know, sort of newborn stage into the world, is they find their feet. They literally start discovering their hands and feet. And so this is when we get to house 2. So house 2 rules assets, material things, and values. So all things that are tangible and have worth. So in the same way, you know, when babies discover their feet and they're like, holy crap, like, what are these things? You know, I've got fingers and toes, and, you know, they're so fascinated by them. So the second house tends to rule those sort of things. So it talks about money, it talks about income, it talks about things that we own, even the style of, you know, home decor or things we have around us. How we deal with money is often talked about a lot in terms of our second house and things that we find valuable. So again, any planets you have in this house will impact how money and assets function in your own life. So there are a few other houses that talk about money specifically, but this is in the term of coming and going, what you physically have around you. And then we move on to the next stage of human growth, of course, which is communication, which is like siblings, which is neighbors, which is when you start interacting with the outside world, the coming and going. So this talks about short trips, it talks about your neighbors, it talks about your siblings or people that you respond to as siblings. It talks about friends on an interaction level, so not on a sort of a deep soul, like soul tribe friendship level, but it talks about the interactions that we have. And of course, then this also rules our communication. And there's 2 communication houses in the natal chart. So that's the 3rd house and also the 9th house, which is up here. The 3rd house is really interesting because it's not a particularly deep house. If we're looking at the 12 stages of growth, the first 6 houses are to do with the day-to-day practical 3D things. So we have the self, we have the physical things around us and the things that we value, including money and assets, and physical gifts and that sort of thing. And this also includes talents, by the way. So anything you value in yourself is ruled by the 2nd house. So the 3rd house is our coming and going with our daily life. So our siblings will come into this, our communication, our early education as well, which is really, really important, especially if you're looking at how you learned to study, how you were treated at school, experiences you had in your childhood. A lot of that will be shown in the 3rd house and how you assert yourself in conversation. I have a lot of things in the 3rd house. So verbalizing is a big part of this house. So whatever you have in that house needs to be verbally addressed. So that would be our 3rd house. Then we move into the 4th house. And as you can see here, the chart is split into quadrants. So the first 3 houses, so from 1 to 4, are about the self. So the self, our things, and the communications and the coming and going. The 4th house is ruled by what we call the IC. And the IC, as you can see, is the lowest point of the chart. So when we talk about karma, we do talk about, as I said last week, or this week rather, the South Node. But in terms of the actual chart itself, we always tend to look at what is on or around the 4th house or the IC, because this is the very base of our chart. This is what almost didn't make it into our life, but maybe just squeezed in, So if we are talking about karmic stuff, if we're talking about things we inherited from our mother or our mother's side of the family, when we get into the 4th house itself, we talk about our foundation, what keeps us grounded. So in a lot of ways, the 4th house can show us as well what limits us, especially if there's more difficult planets or placements in there. But so the 4th house would rule things like your country of origin, your original culture, your family, your tribe, your relatives, the day-to-day existence that you had when you were growing up, And so for a lot of us, what we inherit from that 4th house and from that IC is a lot of stuff that we have to learn to release. We learn to have to transform in some way. So that's a really interesting house to look at how you deal with karma. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how the planets work in the next video, which will hopefully make more sense. Now, as we get into the 5th house over here, this is the house of the heart. So number 5 rules all things heart related. So in the astrology chart, it talks about our children, but it also talks about the ways in which we act like a child, as in expressive and free and pure. So arts and crafts, creativity, fun, romance, dating. Your approach to dating, as in not heavy committed relationships, but dating itself, will be whatever's going on in the 5th house. And what's really interesting about 5, the significance of number 5, is it always talks about being the odd one out and having to assert yourself as different in some way. And so whatever we have in the 5th house shows us what we have to kind of stand apart from the crowd in order to feel emotionally fulfilled, because the fifth house is where we find a lot of fulfillment. So again, if we're looking at in stages of human development, we've gone through our communication in the third house, we've gone into what our beliefs are, our karma is, the family that we grow up in. And then once, as children, we start getting to that stage where at school, we're learning, we're creating, we're expressing and discovering our personality, then we're getting into the fifth house. So when we start discovering what it is we're interested in, what kind of people we like, how much influence we can have over people, how different we want to be, how we want to express ourselves, those are all fifth house things. But whatever we have in the fifth house, like I said, it will always take a little bit of a risk to express fully, because whatever's in the fifth house is about what's coming from our heart. Now, as we get into the sixth house, the sixth house rules routine, it rules work, it rules service. This all sounds very boring, but it's not, because this used to be what we called one of the houses of the divine. And the divine was where you were of service to the higher being, to your god or to your goddess. And so in terms of not our career, but in terms of what we do for a job, this falls into the sixth house nowadays. So also animals, any pets we have in our life, our physical body, our health, our wellness. So if you have a lot in the sixth house, you have a lot of healing capacity and a real need for ritual and purification, because six is about harmony and it's about healing, but it's about tangible results. We're not getting so much into the spiritual, we're staying more on the earthly plane of healing, so to speak. So even, for example, you might be a beauty therapist, but this is your healing work, because you're making people feel beautiful and loved and valued when you perform whatever service for them. So whatever rules your sixth house, whatever is in your sixth house, is where you bring divinity to day-to-day life. So it's a really, really interesting house. And then, this is the other thing I wanted to say as well. When we talk about the physical body, we talk about the first house and we also talk about the sixth house. So if there's issues around unwellness, sickness, allergies, sensitivity, have a look at what rules your first and sixth houses, and have a look at what planets are in both of those houses as well, because both of those will impact your physical body. Now, the seventh house and the descendant, and this is when we start getting into the top half of the chart. So the ascendant, of course, is beginning of the seventh house, and it is across from the ascendant. So the ascendant is how we perceive the world and what we see and our personality and what we put out there. The seventh house is who we attract in to balance us out. So whatever you have around the descendant is the kind of people that are almost magnetically attracted to you. And then once we get into the seventh house traditionally was called soulmates and enemies, which is all very dramatic, but we don't necessarily have enemies per se. Hope none of you do, because I don't have enemies anymore. But it talks about committed relationships, and it's so interesting, I think, that traditionally and in ancient astrology, the house of the soulmate and the house of the enemy fell into the same house. And why is that? And that is because, when we talk about soul contracts, we make agreements with others before this lifetime about what role they're going to play in our life. So the purpose of people, even that come out as enemies in our life, or people that harm us or bring us down, is to awaken us to more healing, and is to awaken us to our full divinity, and is to awaken us to our full power and authenticity. So it's not just our lovers or our soulmates that we have soul contracts with. It's also our enemies, or the people that cause us difficulty. So I think that's such a fascinating part of ancient astrology, because they knew this. They believed that the role of the enemy, or the person that causes difficulty, stress, or upset in your own life, is just as important for your growth and healing as are the people that love you. So whatever's going on in the 7th house will show you what kind of people are making an impact most strongly on your life. It's also important to look there as well, because if you have a bit of a habit, as lots of intuitive people do, of attracting very, very wounded souls, very, toxic people, or just not the kind of person that you would want, have a look at what rules your 7th house and see if that can bring some insight into what kind of energies. Also, whatever, and I'll talk about this again in the next video, whatever planet or whatever sign rules your 7th house tends to be the sign or the energy of people that are most attracted to you. So for me, my 7th house is ruled by Scorpio, and I actually have Pluto in there as well, which is exciting. So definitely I tend to attract people who need healing, people who have self-destructive patterns, or people that have been a victim of destructive behavior by other people. And so the way that I channeled this was going on to do a degree in counseling so that I wouldn't end up receiving that energy in my life as destructive relationships. And obviously, like everyone, I learned that the hard way. I channeled that through, doing a degree in counseling, doing the work that I do, my agreement being, okay, if I'm attracting plutonic souls that have suffered some trauma, I'm going to attract them on a professional level rather than attracting partners that are harmful. So, technically, in traditional astrology, Pluto in the 7th house would be the absolute worst thing. It's like, oh my God, you're going to attract a power-hungry villain, into your life. But with anything, and this is the beauty of a natal chart, every single thing in your natal chart you can turn to your benefit, or you can channel into something really powerful. So don't ever fall into the trap of thinking this is a bad placement, or I wish I had this, or I wish I had something else. Your natal chart is so unique to you, and it is a real toolbox of completely unique things that you can kind of mix and match to bring about what it is that you want in your life. So 7th house, all relationships, the really, really positive and the really, really negative. The 8th house, which is where things get very dark. So traditionally, again, in traditional astrology, the 8th house and the 12th house were seen as the bad houses and very, very negative, because the 8th house rules power, like the spider. So spiders, as we know, are very small, but they're incredibly powerful, and they weave. They can travel long distances. They trap their prey. They trap what it is that they want. And this is the power of the 8th house, is that spider energy of alchemy, of turning pain into wisdom. It also rules, the 8th house rules sexuality. It rules, when I say the occult, that's a really loaded word, but it rules the occult in terms of spirituality that's not airy-fairy, so to speak. Spirituality that's grounded, spirituality that comes from the ancestors, tribal spirituality, shamanic spirituality, awareness of dark energies, kundalini energies, also ruled by the 8th house. It also rules other people's money. So that's a really interesting thing, because again, other people's money is about power. And traditionally, up until the last, say 50 years for women, we were so heavily ruled and so controlled by sex and money. Who had the power to bring about our demise was normally our fathers or our husbands, who controlled us through fertility, who controlled us through money and land and ownership and all those sort of things. So the 8th house traditionally is seen as the dark house, but it's not. It's an incredibly, incredibly powerful house, and a lot of healers will have a lot of things, a lot of planets, a lot of energy in their 8th house, because we're all here to transmute a lot of old ways of living. So the 8th house gets a bad rep. It's not. It's incredibly powerful. I actually have an 8th house stellium, so I had an astrologer, believe it or not, when I was like 5 years old, look at my chart and tell my mum I was going to kill someone or I was going to be a prostitute. So, never ended up doing either of those things. But I still think I'm using all that 8th house stuff. So again, if you have 8th house planets, don't be alarmed by the doom and gloom. It's incredibly powerful, but it's also energies that other people would not want us to use. So it's something to be aware of, because the 8th house, whatever rules your 8th house, whatever planets you have in there, will trigger other people. So that's a really interesting complex house to look out for. So sex, money, power, other people's money, but also taxes. You know, because again, it's a way of empowering or disempowering a person. So interesting. The 9th house, again, is when we start to expand even further into the realm of spirituality. So again, if we're looking at this in terms of human growth, the 7th house would be, you know, our teenage years, our early 20s, when we start to fall in love. You know, the 6th house is when we go out, we get a job, we start being of service, we start being useful in society. The 7th house is when we start meeting lovers and enemies and all those sorts of things. We get married, or we meet people we'd like to be in a relationship with, we commit in some way. The 8th house is when we start becoming aware of our power. The 9th house is really interesting because this is where we start to expand our vision. So the 9th house, just like the 3rd house, also rules communication, but it rules communication of the higher mind. So travel, philosophy, religion, spirituality in a theoretical sense, so to speak. It rules things that open our vistas, that expand our possibilities and grow our mind. So whatever you have in the 9th house is what's going to take you away, what's going to grow you in this lifetime. So if you ever feel bored, or you ever feel like stuck or stagnant in your own life, or you want to study something but you don't know what to study, or something like that, have a look at your 9th house. Because whatever planets are in there, whatever it's ruled by, is a really good indication of how you can use that house and what specifically you can learn about that would be best for you specifically. And also the 9th house rules teaching. So it can also rule things like law, writing, journalism, teaching, anything again where we're expanding other people's minds. So a lot of teachers I know will have a 9th house stellium. They'll have their sun or Mercury or something in the 9th house. If you have Venus in the 9th house, I will tell you straight up, you are not going to meet your partner in the same country as you live in. I have never yet met a 9th house Venus person that has married someone from their own country. So the 9th house is the travel house. Religion is also a big thing here. Like I said, theoretical, rhetoric in spirituality. But it's a really growthful house. It's where can move you beyond. So, if you tend to get stuck in some of these lower houses, or some of these lower house experiences, look to your 9th as a way to grow out of there, or as a way to find leverage out of a stuck situation. Where are we at now? 10th house. So, the 10th house is when we come up here and we have the MC. And the MC is our pinnacle of career success. So this talks about, obviously the 6th house talks about work in the sense of service. The 10th house talks about our career in terms of what we give to the world and how the world sees us. So the ascendant is how we as a human being are seen and how we see the world. The IC is what we receive from our family. The descendant is significant others. And the MC is what we give to the world on a major scale. So we come from the karma of the IC and we create the destiny of the MC. So look around your MC, look around your 10th house for where you would have the most career success, where you would find reward, where you would find Fame is ruled by the 10th house. Anyone with Leo in the 10th house tends to be really like major celebrity potential. When you look at, I look at a lot of celebrity charts for a few of my clients, and the 10th house for people that are well known is normally packed. So whatever planets, whatever rules your 10th house is how you can spread your message in the most effective way. So if you are self-employed, look at your 10th house in terms of, look at your 9th house in terms of what you could teach other people, but look at your 10th house in terms of how you can best spread that message. So is it through TV? Is it through writing a book? Is that not how you want to do it? You know, how do audiences tend to respond to you? How can you use that to your advantage? You know, so the 10th house, if you want material, abundant fame, audience success on a big scale, look at your MC and look at your 10th house. So the 10th house is like, say the person, we're looking at the scheme of growth in the whole wheel. They've had their relationship, they've discovered their own power, they've started to travel the world because they want some meaning. The 10th house is what they create from all those experiences. So that's the best-selling book, or that's the TV show or the reality show where someone says, I want to hear what you've got to say. So whatever's in the 10th house is when people go, right, tell us what you have to say about all of this. So it's a really, really interesting house. And I'm going on about this a lot because I know a lot of you are stepping into entrepreneurship. So utilize that 10th house energy, whatever that may be. The 11th house is, okay, you've had all the success, you've gone out to the world, you've found meaning, you've published a best-selling book, or you've got a TV show, or you've made $1 million or whatever thing. The 11th house talks about groups, it talks about ideals. It's the humanitarian house, because we're getting towards, the end of the wheel, of the life cycle. It doesn't mean you're going to die or anything, but I mean, we're getting towards the completion, the perfection of the cycle. So the 11th house is when we go beyond the pinnacle of human success, which is the 10th house, and we go into, well, what legacy do we want to leave humanity? How we go back to our core being as a living thing on this earth. So when we talk about nature, we talk about humanitarianism, we talk about friendships, as in deep friendships that inspire us. When we talk about our idols, our dreams, our networks, organizations, big companies are all in the 11th house. So if you have a lot in the 11th house, you have a lot of potential to influence large amounts of people. You could be a cult leader if you wanted to, or you can go and work for a major international corporation. So the 11th house is when we can impact people on a social, a societal, or a humanitarian level. And it's our dreams, it's our vision. It's what do you want for a better world? What do you want the world to look like for your kids or grandkids? You know, that's what the 11th house rules. And then we get into the 12th house, which is the final house of the natal chart. And traditionally, if you Google this, the 12th house is called the house of self-undoing, which sounds very doom and gloom, but it's not. It rules the void. So we reach the pinnacle of human success throughout our human journey, and then we go on, create a legacy for humanity, and then that's our life done. So what is beyond human life? What is beyond humanity? Well, spirit and divinity and heaven and dreams and the intangible, and what I call the void, which is the void where all things come from. So that's what the 12th house rules. And the reason that traditionally, along with the 8th house, this was considered a bad house is because obviously religion was a lot more strict in most countries that practiced astrology up until, 50 years ago. So anyone who openly communed with the divine, whether it be angels, their spirit guides, their gods, goddesses, whatever, were seen to be evil or witches or satanic or something, having power that goes beyond human power. So ignore any kind of negative connotation to the 12th house, because that is the most spiritual house. It's also the house because it represents dissolving the boundaries between human and spirit. whatever's in the 12th house can be sometimes what was a little bit blocked or what we have trouble manifesting into reality. So it's stuff that needs extra effort to bring into fruition in our lives. And something else that's really interesting about the 12th house, just anecdotally, is it often represents our experiences in utero. So what was going on when your mother was pregnant with you? Or what was going on at the time you chose to incarnate into your family? So I always think that's a really interesting thing. Again, with the 4th house, again with the South Node, the 12th house is always really interesting to look at in terms of karma or past life experiences, past life memories, subliminal memories, all those kinds of things, what was really going on. And then we get back to the 1st house. It's like we dissolve into the divine void that is the 12th house. We're welcomed back by spirit and we heal. The 12th house also rules healing along with the 6th. Where we become just one with the universe. It represents the universe. It represents potential. So again, while it represents potential, and anything you have in the 12th house has divine potential and leading, it also requires probably double the human amount of effort to manifest that into reality. And something interesting about 12th house as well that I will mention is if you have Mars or Venus in the 12th house, you may in relationships attract people that are not quite ready to step up or have problems with committing or problems with being fully present for whatever reason. Sometimes addictions as well. A lot of addictive personalities tend to have a lot going on in their 12th house, also in their 8th house, because it doesn't have the boundaries and the expectations of other houses. So have a look at what's in your 12th house in terms of what kind of people are drawn to you, because the 12th house is like, your spiritual gifts, your psychic ability, all those sorts of things. And so people that are very wounded or people that aren't ready to show up will often be attracted to you if you have a lot in the 12th house, or you have particularly Mars and Venus in the 12th house, because the expectation is that you're not going to have the same needs. You're almost like such a divine being that you don't have human needs. So they don't need to be on time. They don't need to commit. They don't need to do anything like that, which can be so frustrating because people with a lot of 12th house planets are very sensitive souls, are empathic souls, and they wonder why they experience so much rejection. So that is the house where you need super duper boundaries so that you can access all that divine energy. And people that once they tap that, they become incredible at manifesting. So, my dears, that is the 12 houses and what they rule. Of course, you have your keywords there as well. If you have any other questions about any of the particular houses or anything you've read that worries you a little bit, just let me know. Just drop me a wee email. I am really worried. I'm really curious. I'm not worried. I'm really curious about how you're all going with it as well. So feel free to pop me through an email this week. And in the next video, I will talk about the signs and what it is that they rule. So we'll speak soon. Thank you. Bye.